already been carried away. Okay, let me just be sure that I started before I continue so that it can be beneficial to everyone. So I'm leaving the link, in the chat session. So just try to. Okay, so here's the tip, right? So we have the tip here. So here's where you enter the tip, and this is an input field, right?
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. Then we have some set of buttons, and this button says 5%, this one says 10%, this one says 15%. So what that means is that whatever this bill is going to be, so if it is $2,000 for instance, if 5% is what you click, that means 5% of 2,000 naira, $2,000 is what the customer wants to tip you with, or you and your colleagues, depending on the number of people, right? And the number of people will be entered here, so it could be 10 persons, could be 2 persons. Let's just say that you were very fortunate, it was just 2 of you that came to work because of one heavy rain, or the others haven't arrived yet. So this is the number of people, which is also an input field. So if you say 5% of $2,000 is the tip that the customer is giving, do you get the point? That means we have to be able to what? Get 5% of 2,000, and 5% of 2,000 is what? $100. Isn't that correct?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So now, our major point of interest, because all of this is what we will enter inside of our application. So let's say now we are the ones building the application, but the user that will use the application ultimately, their point of interest is the left hand side of this form, of this particular interface. Their point of interest is how can they enter the bill, how can they choose how many percent, and how can they enter the number of people to share the tip. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so everything logic in our application is supposed to go on this right hand side, because we want to be able to calculate what the tip amount per person. That's what this place is all about. So let me see if I can do this. Okay, I just made that bigger a little bit. So the tip amount per person, right, will go here. So let's say in the case of $100 being 5% of $2,000, if you be sharing $100 amongst 2 people, what will be your tip amount per person? 100 divided by 2, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, that's $50 per person. Does that make sense? Yeah. So the total amount that the person is supposed to give you, because as a result of the tip is going to be given to you, is going to be the total amount you were supposed to pay, which in this case is what? $2,000, right? Plus the 5% of $2,000, which is what? $100. So his bill, the total bill is going to be the bill plus the tip. Does that make sense? So we are going to have $2,100 as a total amount, and this one is not per person, it's just total bill, so there's no per person here. So I think let's just quickly correct that in the HTML. So the total total bill. So this is going to be the total bill, right? Makes sense. So we now have the total bill being $2,150 as tip per person. Then we have 2 people, and then we have $2,000, generally. So now we have all of this figured out. So the problem now is, how do we access because we know we cannot do anything logical or engage any interaction, engage the user at any interactive level using just HTML, right? That is why we need JavaScript. So how do I target the input element that is supposed to take the bill from the user? How do I target the amount of percentage that the user picks? How do I target the number of persons inside of the input field here when the user enters it? Those are very important questions, right? I understand the fact that in JavaScript I can actually I understand the fact that in JavaScript I can do a couple of calculations and do a couple of logical things in JavaScript. I understand that. So but the point is, how do I access what is imputed in my HTML element inside of my JavaScript? How can I access it so that I can apply logic as we've learned with JavaScript? Definitely at this point in time we've done a couple of things with JavaScript. We know we have operators, we know we can multiply, we know we can divide things, we know we can we can subtract things from each other. So but how do we link all of this power that JavaScript has with our HTML element? That is the important question at this point in time. So do you understand, Abigail? Do you understand Triumph?
Yes, I understand.
Okay. So now, if you've seen the video from the first class, I told you that while you start engaging with, JavaScript inside of your HTML, or when you start engaging with HTML inside of a JavaScript, I think that's the proper way to put it, that the JavaScript engine basically converts everything in your HTML file to an object. So we have a model where your HTML document becomes an object, and that's what we call the DOM, the document object model. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Now, please can you repeat?
Sir.
Yeah?
Please can you repeat?
Okay. I said while you're trying to access your HTML document inside of your JavaScript. So here's where we are importing our JavaScript file. I'm sure you are aware of what this means and what this does exactly. The screen.
Yes.
Yeah. And this one we'll put at the bottom of the body tag is so that JavaScript can be the last thing to load, because if JavaScript loads first, you might need to access a couple of things in your HTML that aren't available at that point in time. So you normally put JavaScript at the bottom of the screen, and there's a way there's an extra parameter you have to pass in if you want to use it at the top of this and inside of your head tag. But let's leave that for now. So we have JavaScript brought into our HTML file. So now we want to be able to access the HTML document, inside of our JavaScript, because basically it's a document. Everything, every file you save in your computer is basically a document. You could have, an Excel document and an Excel spreadsheet, which is a document. You could have an MP3 document. You could have different kinds of documents. So a file that has a .html extension is also a document, right?
Yes.
So I said when you are importing, your HTML document inside of your JavaScript, the JavaScript engine in your browser converts your HTML document into an object. Does that make sense? And you understand that while we are dealing with objects in JavaScript, what we normally have is what? Property value pairs, right?
Yes.
Then we also have methods that are basically properties but functions, being their value.
Yes.
Yeah. So now that's how we have the DOM. The DOM actually means the document object model. So that means the document has become an object. And which document are we referring to? The HTML document.
Yes.
So the HTML document is now an object. So now that we know that the HTML document is an object, how do we access the properties and values inside of the HTML document inside of our JavaScript? Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So now, just as a way of killing our curiosity, so let me just do a console.log document, and let's open our console and see what we have. So when I do that, you can see we have document here, and when I expand it, you can see we have the entire HTML document. So when I open it, you can see we have basically everything we wrote inside of our HTML. So it has been imported as document. Are you seeing that?
Yes, sir.
So you can see, if I inspect the HTML document, you can see that it is the exact same thing we have in our inner body, top body, and so on. So that's exactly what we have here. So whenever you make reference to the document inside of your JavaScript file, you are basically talking about the entire area from the top underneath your address bar or your toolbar in your browser down to the bottom of the screen. Every area where your HTML document fills up is referred to as a document. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So now we could do something like document.body, because we know that the body exists inside here. So you can see we have our body tag here, right? I can see I can see it is being treated as an object. Are you seeing that?
Yes, sir.
Okay, that's not the okay, type of. So you can see it's an object. Type of document is an object. So it's basically an object. So the HTML document is an object inside of a JavaScript once you start engaging with it. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So at this point, it is very important for you to understand that the most parent element in your browser is not the document. guess what the topmost element, the topmost object inside of your browser is? Can anybody guess that? Okay, I must have done that. I said that before, but it is the window object. So everything is enclosed in the window object. You get it? So as you can see, when I open the window object, you will have your document in the window. So you can see the document is a property of the window object. And when I open a document, you can see we now have body inside of it. And you will see that we have all of the children, and the children are basically all of the HTML tags we have inside of it. So the HTML tag also has its own children, and this is just basically us expanding, an object, just like we've been dealing with objects before. So you can see every element has its own children. So when I open, and you can see we started with the window object, right? When you open the window object, we have the window object, right? So inside of it, we know we have the document, right? And this is the document. So when I open a document, you see we have body, but let's not focus on body, let's focus on children, because everything you write inside of the opening and closing tag, especially for a parent tag, is always the children of that tag. Does that make sense? So when you have a div, you put a button inside a div. The button is the child, just like we know in CSS. So an element can have children. So when you open the children of which tag are we in? The document, right? When you open the children, you will see it has how many children? I think it has 2 children. So it has what? 2 children. Sorry, 1 child rather. So what is that 1 child? Remember, it's just the HTML tag that is the child of the body tag, right? So it has 1 child. So we also see that we now see the same set of keys and properties inside of the parent element, inside of the HTML. Remember, all of the things we are seeing here inside of the document, we are also seeing it here, sort of. So when you open the this, you now see the head and body. So we have the head and body. So when you go and look at the properties of the body, you also see that the body also has children. And when we open that, you will see that we now have what? 0, 1, 2, 3. And when we go to our HTML and you check how many children really does our body tag have, and let's look at that quickly. We have we have 1 and we have 2, right? So it has this script tag and the other script tag. You can see it actually referencing the script tags as children, right? And I think we have one script tag somewhere else, but I'm not so sure. So maybe one of the CDNs we imported. Yeah, I'm not so sure about that. So, but it actually, it's telling you that we have a script tag that is a child, so we don't know which one. So it could be, a plugin that I have in my browser, right? So, but we know we have this div, which we created, which is this div. So when I open the div, and what's the first child of our div? It's basically another div that has a class name of top body, right? So the div has 2 children primarily. So when I go to the children of that div, you can see it will have 2 children, top body and inner body. Can you see them? So basically, this is an object we are dealing with. So if you've been paying attention to how we've been working with objects initially, you will now realize that, okay, now that we know that the document is an object, we have a lot of power over it. We could change a couple of things. We could set properties. And remember I said the objects in JavaScript are being stored in the heap. So they have a life cycle that they don't get destroyed immediately. You can reassign them, you can alter their value. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So now we understand that the window has a child, and the name of that child is document. You get, and we can really abstract. We don't have to do window.document. We could just do, since you are always in the window object, you could just do document. Do you get the point? Just like we could just do alert, because alert is directly inside of the window object. We could just reference alert straight up. You get, and that's why you can do alert hello world, alert this. So this is the document, so it's an object. So whenever you see the word DOM, whether in any JavaScript tutorial while you're reading online, understand that it is saying the HTML document, once it is being referenced in JavaScript, is converted into an object. Because like I said before, everything technically in JavaScript is an object. Arrays are objects, functions are objects, everything is an object. It just depends on how you look at it, but at the root level of everything are object, and everything is an object in JavaScript. And that's why JavaScript is grouped among the languages referred to as object-oriented languages, because they treat everything on the basis and concept of objects. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I hope it's clear now. I can actually hear the smile in the yes sir now. So okay, so it's clearer now. So now when we do something like this, So when we have the document, it's very important because you will see me do things like document.getElement by ID. And remember I said whenever you use a dot to reference something or use a dot to chain two words together, what does that suggest to you? That what you have on the right hand side is a property of what you have on the left hand side. Shay? You remember that I mentioned that before. So when we do document dot get element by ID, that means there's no doubt if we check get element by ID is a property of the document object. You get the point? And obviously it is a function, right? Because it takes in parameter, it takes in an argument, right?
Yes, sir.
You get it?
So please come again.
So I said it is because it takes in, an argument, which is what we wrote inside of this calling. Whenever we call a function and we put in a word inside of it, that's an argument. And that's because the function has parameters. So whenever you pass in the value, so you see here that whatever we pass in is what, by definition, the function is already expecting. Do you get the point? Okay, let me give you, for example, let me just quickly do something. So when we have function, my full, get full name, and I do this, and I say full name is going to return, let me just say this, return first name from last, first name, last name. You get the point? When I say this is it. But first name and last name basically don't exist in my function at this point in time. So let me just do a console.log of get full name. You will see it will tell you that this and this is not defined. You can see first name is not defined. So you cannot get full name because because these two are variables, right? They are basically variables. Does that make sense? Hello. So what I could do, please pay close attention to me. What I could do let first name be equal to Ololade, and I could say let last name be equal to Oluwaseun, whatever that means. You get the point? So now I have first name, and you can see in our console we now have Ololade Oluwaseun. Does that make sense? And Oluwaseun is not my name, by the way, it's just a solution. So we have Ololade Oluwaseun. You get the point? But I say Oluwaseun. Are you guys seeing that? So here I define the variables that the function requires inside of the body of the function, so that the variables are now local variables to my function. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
So, but what this means is that this can only generate the name of one person. But when I say get full name, at least I should be able to get the name of different people as long as they enter their first name and their last name. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So let me get rid of these variables now. So what I will do to my function is I will basically pass in two parameters. So the first parameter is going to be the first, or let's just call it F name, whatever I call it doesn't matter. And let's call this one L name. So definitely whenever we try to call our function, when we do like this, you see it will what? You see it's already telling you, and our Visual Studio Code helper is already telling us that okay, get full name expects two arguments. First is F name and the second is last name. Does that make sense? Hello?
Yes, sir.
So now I can pass in triumph. So that's my first argument. So the second argument can be I don't know, how do you spell your name? Okay, let me just say Anya. Okay, you can see that now. So now, okay, sorry. So since we call this F name and L name, we have to change this to F name and L name. You get the point? And we have to change this to L name too. So you can see here we have triumph and here. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
so
sir.
whenever you declare a function expecting values like this, they are called parameters. So the function get full name has how many parameters? It has two parameters. Does that make sense? The first one and the second one. The first one being what? F name, basically the first name of the person, and the second one being L name, meaning the second name of the person. Does that make sense? And you are not restricted to just having parameters. You could have one parameter, you could have three, you could have more parameters, you could even have optional parameters, but that's by the way. So now we have this. So I passed in. So whenever I'm calling the function, are you with me? Whenever I'm calling the function, whatever I pass in is not called a parameter, it is called an argument in JavaScript. So the function has two parameters. So I'm now calling the function with two arguments which should correspond with the two parameters. Does that make sense?
Okay, sir.
Hello, really honestly, does it make sense?
Sir, if
Yes, sir.
yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So arguments are clear now and parameters are clear. And what they mean, what they do. Hello?
Hello?
Okay. And
Yes,
remember, one of the primary reasons why we use functions in JavaScript is so that you can use the same piece of code over and over. So without the idea of parameters, it will be impossible for you to be able to reuse certain codes. For instance, get full name. So if I don't have the liberty of actually entering the name from an external point, or from the point from at which I'm calling this function, that means this function is not necessarily reusable, right? It means whatever I initialize it with is what it has to be called with at every point in time. So when you pass in parameters as such, it makes your function very powerful and you can use them at different points in time. So it doesn't matter what the person's name is, as long as the person knows how to use the function. It knows that the first parameter is f name, the second parameter is last name. So it doesn't matter what the name of the person is or how long the name of the person is. Once you enter it here, it should give you the same result for everybody, as long as you have a first and last name. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So you could also pass in a third argument. Let's say we have age. Does that make sense? So we could pass in, a third argument, and let's say the way we want to use age is, let's say this and this is, age years old. Sorry. Does that make sense? So this is a third argument, and you can see that it says in the console, triumph here is undefined years old because we did not pass in any argument for this other parameter. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Hello. So if we pass, let's say 25, so you can see it puts it here for us, and because we are using string interpolation, so it kind of converts that to a string for us, the 25 to a string. So but that's fine. Can you see that? Hello.
Yes, sir.
And you can see it also tells you when you hover on top of the function, it tells you that the function returns a string. You can see it here, that what the function will return is a string. Hello. So when I do something like 2 plus age, so you see it tells you that the function returns a type of any, but basically it returns a type of number. So here's and here's where certain technologies like TypeScript, I don't know, definitely you might not know about TypeScript now. So because JavaScript is dynamically typed, you don't have to declare the type of a variable, but in statically typed languages, if you declare a variable or declare parameters for a function as such, you have to also declare what those what kind of variables they will be, whether they are going to be string or it's going to be numbers, and that's what you do in TypeScript. Basically you have to declare the type of the variable with the variable. Does that make sense? But yeah, you can see this one is taking a type of any, but in TypeScript that won't allow you. It will tell you straight up that you have to what's it called, that you have to declare the type, and if you declare the type as string, you cannot pass in an argument of a number to it. Does that make sense? So but that's that about functions. And here, let's say we did not pass in this third we did not pass in this third argument. So there's something else we could do to save us from getting undefined. We could also initialize our age variable with a default value, so that if we don't pass in a value, it still gives us that value. But when we pass in a value from outside, it overrides that initial value. Can you see that now? Hello?
Yes, sir.
Hello?
Yes, sir.
So, sir, regardless of the age that is in the function, that's like age 25, as long as 27 is inside console.log, it picks 27 because you run from top to bottom.
Yes. And not even that. Whatever you pass in as an argument will override the default value you initialize your parameter with.
Okay, sir.
You get the point. And then
Yes,
for JavaScript, even if I call the function at the top, you can see I'm calling it before I declare the variable. I am calling it before I define the function. Functions are always hosted, that is, they are taken to the top of the scope when your JavaScript program is being executed. So it doesn't matter where you call your function in your document, they by default in the order of arrangement will always be at the top. You get the point. So their position don't really matter. Yeah, so you now see what a function is like, and basically when you're using VS Code, your function will always have this, is it yellowish, light yellowish, color when you are trying to use them. So I'm trying to show you that about this get element by ID. So obviously now you can see that get element by ID is a function, right? And it takes in one argument, and that argument is basically the ID of the element you are targeting. And I said if you look at your function, if you look at the document object once again, that we are bound to always get, we are bound to find that method inside of it. So let's take a look at it. So we are supposed to find get element by ID inside of this. So let's see the prototype of this object and see what we have. I'm trying to find that. So document dot. So I'm trying to find where the methods are stored in. So that we actually take a lot of what's it called? A lot of looking and poking into it. So, but it should be directly as a child of this. So let's take a look at it. But definitely it has to be a child of the document element, and that's why we are able to access it as such. So but it's probably nested somewhere, and I can't really find it. So but that's fine. So it will always be it's one of the properties that is available. Does that make sense? But here we can basically just see, because I think one of the challenges that I faced in recent times is you don't necessarily get to see some of the methods available on HTML documents when you are referencing them as objects in JavaScript. You could see a few, but it doesn't always behave the appropriate way when you are inspecting an actual object. Does that make sense? But you will know in practice that definitely there's no way you can do document.get element by ID and have a positive value returned to you if this method does not exist on the document object. Does that make sense? Hello?
Yes, sir.
So the only way you're able to access it is because it exists on it. Hello?
Okay.
Okay. So but this is actually general to every element. You could do get element by ID for every element inside of a document. So but that's fine. I think it's not being displayed here. And I think I'm not really sure why that is. But we could only access it. So I said whenever you have a dot connecting two things together, it is suggestive of the fact that what is on the right hand side is actually a property of what is on the left hand side. Does that make sense for you now? Hello?
Hello, sir.
Do you understand what I just said?
Yes, sir.
So I said whenever we have a dot or a full stop connecting two words together in JavaScript as such, it is suggestive of the fact that what you have here is the property inside of what you have on the left hand side.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yes.
So if I decide to do something else like get full name, for instance, it shouldn't exist because get full name does not exist on the property, document object. It's not a property. So the reason why we could use this is because it exists on it. It's available. So when we say get element by ID, so what that method, so just like every method, methods are basically functions, but they are properties of an object. So just like every method, it will definitely do something about the instance of that object. So get element by ID looks inside of the document and looks for the element that has the ID that you pass in here as an argument. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Yeah, so which element has that ID as an argument? So let's look at it. So we have bill input, right? So let's open our div and see which element. So we have this bill input, the class name, So we have bill input, which is the ID. So this input element has this ID, right? This exact ID. Hello. So in our JavaScript, if we say console.log, and let me just delete this function I wrote, we don't need it anymore. So if we say console.log bill input, see what we are going to have here. So you can see it brings us to that particular element that has that, that what's it called? That particular element in our HTML. So you can see it's a form element, and then it has let me just look for a way to let you know that it is really this element. So we have a placeholder, right? So opt so you can see the placeholder is 0, just like we have here. Can you see it? So to let you know that that's actually the element. So we could say document dot what get element by id dot input. So we can say bill input dot placeholder, and let's see what we have. So you can see we have 0. So if I come to my HTML and change the placeholder to, let's say, enter bill, you will see that our placeholder here is going to be enter bill. So you can see how we are accessing it, right? And what we are doing basically is just using the document object model. So this is what is called DOM manipulation. You are accessing the HTML element as an object in your JavaScript, and we can manipulate it whichever way we want. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So we also have another property, which is value. So if I write in the value of, let's say, 100 here, and I say instead of bill input dot placeholder, I can say bill input dot value, and it still gives us the value there, which is 100. So this way now we know we can access whatever it is we wrote inside of our bill input element like this. Does that make sense? We can access it. Can you see that? Hello? Yeah. So but the problem here is that, let's say I did not initialize this value. I just initialized it with 0, just like what we had before. So it is 0. So inside of my tip calculator, inside of the JavaScript, even if I enter a new value here, I won't be able to see it in real time. Does that make sense? I'm not able to see the updated value that I entered here. And the goal of this entire app is that I'm able to listen to whatever the user enters and calculate the value of the bill in real time based on what they enter. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so that brings us to the subject of event listeners. So we want to be able to update the value of this bill input. Do you get the point? As the user types in. So we now say this bill input element, we are now targeting another method inside of it, which is add event listener.